AM560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. I forgot to mention, so I'll mention it now. I did John Cass's Chicago Way podcast this week, so we talked a good deal about Chicago Press Corps, about the ComEd 4 guilty verdicts, the political culture in Illinois. So you can check that out at johncassnews.com if you're so inclined. Okay, let's talk about our military and our national security. The Army will miss its recruiting goals again in 2023 by 40,000 enlisted. That's reported by military.com. The Navy will miss its enlisting goals by 16% in 2023. That's reported by U.S. Naval Institute's proceedings. The Air Force will miss its recruiting goals by 10% in 2023, as reported again by military.com. The Marines are expected to hit their recruiting goals this year. As the least woke element, as one commentator writes, this is perhaps understandable, but they're being targeted by the Die Mob as well, that same Die Mob that dominates the Pentagon and the Biden administration, of course, at its upper reaches, as we've seen exemplified by commentary from General Lloyd Austin, General Mark Milley, Admiral Gilday. Boy, I tell you, it's, I don't know. I mean, maybe the trans ambassadors for the armed services got here just in time, right? All trans military. It's going to shore up our forces. So it seems like an inopportune time to be missing your recruitment targets with the threats that America faces. But what do I know? That's why we have people like Cliff May. Cliff May is the president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and foreign affairs columnist for the Washington Times. Cliff, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Dan and Amy, good to be with you guys.
So what about the import of the armed services not hitting their recruitment goals?
Well, it is troubling at a time of huge tension, and I think if you want to look for the reasons, there's any number. One is we have a woke administration and a woke culture, and what that means is that we are teaching young people that America is not a country worth defending. It's a country we're teaching them what the New York Times 1619 Project taught. This is all about slavery. It's all about all the sins we have done. Why would you want to risk your life to defend this country, given the way it's been presented in too many, I would say, newspapers, not least the New York Times, where I worked for many happy years, and too much in the schools. And then you also have things, and I think it's, a dreadful mistake. Look, you want to go and see a drag show, you're over 18, God bless you, that's fine. Somebody gets up there, looks just like Judy Garland, sounds like her, very entertaining. To say that's what to make that the recruitment poster, I just think at that point, you're looking for a very different kind of person than we have been over the years. It's not the kind of people who say, oh, yeah, I'm going to go into the military. I'm going to defend my country. I'm going to jump out of airplanes. I'm going to shoot guns. I'm going to be a warrior. I'm going to be a war fighter. No, I'm going to be a drag queen, but in my spare time, maybe I'll put on the uniform and do a little work, too.
It reminds me of, Bud Light's miscalculation with Dylan Mulvaney. But you can't walk this one back.
It's the same thing.
But don't you think our enemies are watching this and thinking, what is going on? Like Putin seeing this, thinking, this is just unbelievable to me.
Yes, if you're Xi Jinping in China, if you're Vladimir Putin in Russia, if you're Ali Khamenei in Iran, you have to be thinking, what you have to be thinking is, you know what? I can take it slow. I want to destroy the Americans, but they're doing such a good job destroying themselves. Why am I rushing? What? Just look what's happening. What a decadent society that has become, and they're kind of hopeless there anyhow, aren't they? The Chinese Communist Party, which rules China, is building up its navy, building up its air force, threatening the free people of Taiwan, and thinking at what point do we do this, and do we have to worry that Harpy Daniels is going to hurt us? I don't think they see that as much of a problem. And there's one other point that I'll bring in here because it's why you called me initially. I had a column last week in the Washington Times, and my thesis there is we believe, most of us, that when the Soviet Union ceased to exist on Christmas Day 1991, the Cold War was over. My argument is actually that's not the case, and the reason is, how do you define the Cold War? If the Cold War was the Soviet Union versus the United States, just those two nations, well, then the collapse of the Soviet Union means the Cold War is over. But if the Cold War means, and I think this is the way I always perceived it, it's the historic battle between communists and capitalists. And by capitalists, that's a name that Marx gave to people who believed in free enterprise, free exchange of goods, free labor, unions, all the things we have here. Well, that's still going on. The only difference is the communists in the Kremlin no longer lead the Cold War against the United States and its allies. It's now the communists in Beijing that lead it. They're stronger, they're more powerful than the communists in the Kremlin ever were. Xi Jinping is the most powerful communist in world history, more powerful than Lenin, more powerful than Stalin, probably by many measures more powerful even than Mao Zedong.
I want to get to this, but I want to go back to the recruitment thing for a second, because there's another aspect of this that I want you to address, and that is a combination of young people who don't have the can't meet the physical requirements to be in the military, have a criminal record, or are more interested in playing Call of Duty than answering a call of duty. Mm-hmm. So how does that factor into the recruitment goals, in addition to the identitarian nonsense going on in the Pentagon like everywhere else?
It absolutely does. When you can't meet your recruitment goals, what's going to happen, what is likely to happen, you're going to, well, I guess we can't have the same standards we once had if we want to fill those slots. And that's a real problem. My son is an officer in the U.S. Army. He's Ranger tabbed. He's a paratrooper. By the way, there were women with me in Ranger School, and if they did it like I did it, I'm perfectly comfortable fighting next to them, being in a foxhole next to them, jumping out of an airplane with them. But I want everyone to do what we have to do. And Ranger School is really rough, right? It's the beginning of beginning of Special Forces, really rough. But if you have, as you say, people coming in who are badly educated, overweight, not fit, don't have discipline, you're going to have an army that is not competitive. And an army that's or an Air Force or Navy that's not competitive, those people will get killed very quickly.
Going back to China and Russia and this Cold War we're in, if you look at it from an ideological perspective, and I agree with you. So in your piece that you referenced, you suggest that we should, or the call has been, and it seems like you are inclined to this position, we need to move away from the policy of containment, the George Kennan policy of containment that we used with respect to the Soviets, and more towards what Matt Pottinger calls a policy of constrainment. Differentiate the two for us.
Yeah, right. With containment, we didn't want the Soviet Union continuing to take over other countries. After World War II, most of the European empires fell apart. All the countries became independent. One empire remained, and that was the Soviet Empire, which replicated the Russian Empire, except more, because behind the Iron Curtain, you had in East Europe, Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia. These countries were satellites, we called them, of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Empire was even bigger, and we tried to contain it and not let it begin to get satellites in Africa and Latin America and other places. What Matt Pottinger has talked about, he was Deputy National Security Advisor, we just want to constrain them. For example, we want to constrain China so that it doesn't totally take over the United Nations system, which the U.S. pays for beyond anybody else. About a quarter of the UN budget is the U.S., not China. We pay 10 times as much for the World Health Organization as does China. But China has essentially taken over the World Health Organization, certainly did during COVID, and is taking over other UN organizations. We want to constrain it from doing that. China wants us, we lead, not the U.S., the so-called international community. And the international community, well, the international community will abide by the rules we make in Beijing, not any other rules. So we're talking about training them. And it also, here's the thing, and I think it's important just to understand briefly the history of this. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, why did we think that we could take a holiday from history? Why did we think we could take a peace dividend? We had no problems. Partly because it was the general belief, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives alike, that China was becoming kind of capitalist. It didn't take communism seriously anymore. And so Bill Clinton, I don't blame him for this, it made sense at the time, said, let's bring China into the World Trade Organization. We'll bring them in as a developing nation. We'll help them make them rich. If they're rich, they'll like us. We'll give them prosperity, which we actually were able to do. They through their participation, through stealing a lot of our intellectual property, which we ignored, they became richer and richer. Now, where are we right now? Well, Xi Jinping, who's the president and the leading communist, he has declared specifically that it's his historical mission to utilize the tools of dictatorship to realize a future in which capitalism will perish and socialism will triumph. He said Marxism was created to change the destiny of human history. I'm quoting now. A collectivized world, he said, is just there over the horizon. Whoever rejects that world will be rejected by the world. We have to understand that's what he plans. That's what he's doing.
Yeah, I know he's not mincing words. Yeah, it's very clear.
Right.
So the constrainment, though. So a constrainment of control of these ineffectual world government organizations. Okay, that's one thing. What about China's Belt and Road Initiative, where they're playing a game of Risk with the map and influencing countries in the developing world too, ultimately to enlist them as allies? I mean, so it seems to me that does constrainment address that? Does constrainment address them setting up Confucius Institutes at American universities or police stations in New York City?
100%. All of that. They need to be constrained from setting up police stations on American soil so they can monitor Chinese and others who are saying things they don't want said, and there will be repercussions if that happens. They've got to constrain that. Confucius Institutes, yes, meant to inculcate and indoctrinate college students in Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Shiism, all of the above. We need to constrain that. Yes, we have a huge problem, not least in Latin America and Africa. And I'll just mention this. There's something called the Latin American Development Bank, very important, mostly, again, American money to produce development. The Chinese have little by little, without spending a lot of money, been taking that over. So under the Trump administration, the first time ever there was an American president of the Latin American Bank. The Trump administration thought that was important. Wonderful guy, Mauricio Corone, American Cuban background. His mission there was to reduce Chinese power at the bank and in Latin America. Day one of the Biden administration, Mauricio is fired.
Mm-hmm. And just in terms of constrainment, give us a couple of top lines of what that looks like, policies that we're not pursuing to constrain China that we should be considering, if not moving on.
Well, I'll give a shout out to a report that comes out of the Heritage Foundation, which is another think tank, an allied think tank, a very good one, and it's written by Michael Pillsbury, who's one of the best, I think, China scholars in the country, and three other people at Heritage, including Jim Carafano, and what that is all about in a very detailed way is how to win the Cold War. It's called Winning the New Cold War. A little different than the way I've said it, which is that the Cold War never ended, but that's fine. It's a new Cold War. We recognize it, and what he says in that, what the authors say, is that protecting the U.S. homeland and prosperity and diminishing China's ability to harm the U.S. will require a whole of government and whole of society approach. That means it's got to become a priority. It's got to become more important than the U.S. building charging stations for Teslas around the country. It's got to become something that is you can't do this. You can't win a Cold War in your spare time. You can't win a Cold War, but frankly, while you are waging a war against fossil fuels. The Chinese have no intention of waging a war against fossil fuels. If every American internal combustion engine were turned off tomorrow and turned off for the next 5 years, would the temperature change globally? Not at all. Not significantly. Not so you could measure. Among other reasons, the Chinese are building about one coal-fired power station every week. Coal, if you're worried about emissions of carbon dioxide. People like to say carbon because it sounds dirty, but it's carbon dioxide, which is plant food. It's what you exhale. If you want to do that, it's easy to do. You burn natural gas instead of coal. It's about half as much. Or build small nuclear power stations. No emissions whatsoever. But what this administration is focusing on, getting people into electric cars, and the electricity got to come from somewhere, and saying, well, it can come from sunlight, it can come from wind. Not exactly. Not in any substantial measure. That's going to have no impact whatsoever on global climate change if that's what you're worried about. So instead of doing that, do other things and worry and spend time and spend energy on how you fight the cold. Do we know how to fight a cold war? We actually do because we fought one. And this one's more challenging, but we have to look at what we did right and what we did wrong, and then implement those policies. And yes, that means challenging the Belt and the Belt and Road Initiative, which in a lot of cases is debt traps and makes those nations dependent on China. It means all the other things you talked about: Confucius Institutes and police stations and Interpol and the UN system and much more. But there has to be a focus of the administration in power right now. That's not the case.
He is Cliff May, president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and foreign affairs columnist for the Washington Times. Cliff, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's what Chicago is talking about. It's Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy on AM 560. The Answer.
Some save money for one big dream vacation. I take the kids camping twice a year.
For me, what's most important is sharing with my community members in need.
My financial goals? Expect the unexpected and plan accordingly.
At Thrivent, we believe money is a tool, not a goal. Driven by a higher purpose at our core for more than 100 years, we offer expert financial advice that starts with what's important to you. Visit Thrivent.com to learn more.
Balance of Nature has been using whole fruits and vegetables to change lives for decades. But did you know about Balance of Nature's revolutionary fiber product? Balance of Nature's Fiber and Spice uses a well-researched blend of whole fiber sources, such as psyllium husk, flaxseed, whole monk fruit, and whole apple, to provide your body with powerful nutrition. It contains 12 carefully selected spices, including cinnamon, ginger, turmeric, and cumin, just to name a few. Each ingredient helps in getting the essential nutrition you need. It supports overall wellness and gut health, giving you the ability to live your best life no matter your age. Balance of Nature's fruits and veggies and fiber and spice work together as